This is a part of our reading from the Gospel this morning. Truly I tell you, Jesus said, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine in all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except the widow of Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they had heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. The Gospel of our Lord. What do you think was going on in the heads of those people who were listening to Jesus? Do you think they had woken up that morning and said to themselves, today, if someone questions my holiness, I think I'm just going to grab them by the neck and throw them off a cliff? Or today, if someone questions my identity as one of the chosen people, I think I'm just going to go ahead and kill them. So the question, of course not, this isn't what they thought in the morning, but what is it that causes a normal person to become part of a mob, part of a crowd that can cause a lot of violence, to do things that they normally wouldn't do? What causes a person to walk away from their values and do something extraordinary like this? I think in our world, it's the same as it was in the world of Jesus' day, and that people are terrified of being alone, of not being part of a crowd, and not having the protection of a crowd around them. Their identity becomes crowd-based. This is a fear that is pervasive throughout our entire lives. Recently, I was at a confirmation retreat, and I had asked, we were going to do a prayer time. And so I asked the kids to think of something that they wanted to pray for, either something they were afraid of or some health issue that they knew of, something they wanted to pray about. And many of them brought up the fear of losing friends, the fear of being alone and losing friends or family. And then, that's for the younger people. They're already afraid of losing friends, but it doesn't go away in a lot of ways. I was talking to some friends of mine recently, and we were amazed that even at our age, after having gone through so many things in life, we still had a niggling feeling of insecurity whenever we felt like we were being left out in a situation, whenever we felt like we weren't part of the crowd. Fear of isolation and loneliness are pervasive throughout our lives. And I think of those as kind of two different things, fear of isolation and fear of loneliness. Fear of isolation is the fear of not being part of a crowd, not being part of a crowd that can give you support. Fear of loneliness is the fear of not having deep one-on-one relationships with people. They're a little bit different in how they manifest themselves. And those fears, I'm not going to say just don't have them, right? They are with us for our whole lives. Our question has to become, what do we do about them? How do we listen to the voice of fear, and what do we give into, and how do we protect ourselves from acting in ways that God is not calling us to act? We have just talked about how we listen to act for the good, and we listen for the voice of God or the voice of the good in order to act for the good. And when we give in to fears of isolation or fears of loneliness, we are unable to listen to act for the good. So the first fear that I want to talk about is that fear of isolation or of not being part of a crowd. So much of our identity can be associated with the crowd that we hang out with. For those people who were in that church, their identity was as the chosen people of Israel. They felt like God had set them aside as a holy and a beloved people. And when Jesus questioned it, they were filled with rage, and partly because of the deep-seated fear that gave them about not being, about their identity, what they had based their identity on. So if we give in to that fear of isolation, there are certain things that can happen. First of all, we allow the crowd to determine our morality. We can allow the crowd to say what is right and what is wrong. So I'm sure there were people in that crowd who knew it was wrong to throw Jesus off a cliff. But they were afraid of losing their identity as being part of the crowd if they were to stand up and say no. This happens so often, whether it's on college campuses with hazing, or in hate groups, or even in the extremes of our political parties on both sides. When behavior happens that we are unwilling to call out as bad behavior because it brings into question our place in the group. So we allow the crowd to dictate our actions, our morality, and our values. Another thing, the second thing that can happen is that we can let our lives become chaotic with busyness in the fear that we might miss out on something. So we keep as many connections as possible, as many groups as possible, so that there's no doubt that we will always have a group to associate with them. And our children are running here, there, and everywhere as we try to maintain those connections for them also. So it takes away from our quality of life because we become chaotically busy. And a third thing is that we can become kind of mercenary in how we think of groups. Say I'm in a group that is doing something, but all of a sudden I see another group that will take time away from this group that might be able to give me a little more prestige or make me look a little bit better in the eyes of others, or that just seems stronger so that it would make me feel safer. So we can become disloyal in our connections to others because we want to maintain as much safety as we can by being part of a group. Those are some of the things that can happen in our fear of isolation or our fear of not being part of a crowd. Our fear of loneliness is just a little bit different. So when we are afraid that we won't be able to find deep, meaningful relationships, sometimes it can cause us to stay in a relationship that is not healthy, that is not, that even sometimes is abusive in its manner, because we're afraid if we let go of this relationship, that if we walk away, we won't find anyone else to be friends with. We can also think about people in the way we think about commodities. I need to obtain that person, obtain a relationship with that person so that it will lift me up. So it's not living out of our core, out of our values for others. It's thinking about how others can make us feel better about ourselves or feel more comfortable with ourselves. And finally, we can allow others to control our behavior just in the same way with the crowd. If we want to maintain a relationship, sometimes we will act in ways that are not in line with our values and morals. So everyone has a fear of loneliness or a fear of isolation. Our question or our goal is not to simply say, well, don't be afraid anymore, but it is to look in our lives for some of these signs of letting that fear take hold and control our behavior in ways that are not helpful and ways that keep us from hearing the voice of God. Being part of a crowd is a powerful thing. And it's something that gives us peace of mind to know that we're in a group and protected. So if you are lonely and dealing with loneliness, there are some practical things to do. I'm filming in my office because it's one of my safe places. And when I'm feeling lonely or feeling as if I cannot get out, it's a place I retreat to. Watch out that you don't retreat so much that you aren't exercising any of your social muscles. Force yourself to get out if you are able to. And if you aren't able to, find some help. Find some help by talking to a professional, talking to one of us pastors, going online and finding some ideas about what to do with loneliness. Maybe there's a book that you can go to. Right now, we're not going to deal so much with the practical steps of how to deal with loneliness, but more we're thinking about that fear of loneliness and the voices that we listen to when we let that fear of prolonged loneliness, the voices that we listen to when we let that fear take over our lives. So what are the voices that we sometimes hear if we have been lonely for a long time? We can hear the voice of culture that tells me I am only significant, I only matter if I have many connections. We can hear the voice of defeatism that I will always, no matter what I do, I will always be lonely. We can hear the voice of escape. The voice of escape says that I can get out of this situation because somebody else will come along and make me happy. All of these are voices in our culture. They're lies in our culture that tell us that there's something wrong, because at the core, all of these voices are part of that voice of inferiority, that perhaps I am not worthy of being known. Perhaps I don't have enough value in the eyes of others to be known. Into that voice, into that reality, non-reality, we have to hear the voice of God speaking. You are my workmanship, it says in Ephesians. You are my workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that you should walk in them. You are God's workmanship. So perhaps during a time of loneliness, instead of listening to the voices of culture, be very intentional about doing what this study is all about. Listening to act for the good. That's what we talked about when we imagined ourselves on stage with a loving parent watching us to see what we're going to do. Now, what are you going to do with loneliness? Are you going to listen to the voices in the crowd around you? Are you going to listen for God's voice? God's voice that tells you, you are my workmanship. I have created you for good works. And here they are. Here are the things that you can do. So, as we're dealing with loneliness, as we're dealing with those voices that tell us we are not enough, our tendency is to want to run to the crowd. But the voice of God doesn't come in the crowd. The voice comes as we as individuals listen to hear God speak into our very own reality. Because when we run into a crowd, we're always afraid that somehow they will find out about us. They will find out that we don't think we are worthy. They will find out about our fears. And then we will be lost in the crowd again. We always need to listen as individuals for that voice of God to remind us that He's looking on with love, that He calls us His workmanship, that He has He has things for us to do that we can listen in order to act for the good. So our goal in thinking about this fear of loneliness isn't to say, if only I could be strong enough, I wouldn't have this fear anymore. It's just to accept it, that we don't want to be lonely. We don't want to be alone. And in that time, in those times when you find yourself being lonely, to listen for the voice of God, the voice of the good, and then to act for the good. We will always have that purpose. And in all of the seasons of life, the times when we have many connections, the times when we have few connections, that we can always be listening to act for the good.